How many days per week should you be running during marathon training? Welcome back to the Run for PRs podcast, where we explore the art and science of running. We help you find the perfect balance in your training. I'm your host, Victoria Phillippi, and today we're tackling a question that every runner has pondered at some point. How many days per week should I really be running? Now, if you've spent any time browsing running forums or listening to other running podcasts, you've probably heard a lot of different answers to this question. Some people swear by 3 days a week. Other people think that you should be running 6 or even 7 days a week. The truth is, there is no magic number or one-size-fits-all approach. The ideal running frequency depends on a variety of factors, and that's what we're going to be diving into today. We'll be exploring how your running experience, training goals, injury history, and even lifestyle can influence the optimal number of days to lace up your shoes. We'll also discuss the importance of listening to your body and finding a sustainable routine that works for you. Now we're going to dive into our key talking points to talk about this topic of running mileage and how many days per week you should run. And honestly, I feel like this topic goes hand in hand with how many miles per week you're running, because if you're only running 3 days a week, chances are you're probably considering yourself more of a lower mileage runner. If you're someone who's running 6-7 days a week, you're most likely doing a little bit higher mileage, just because when frequency goes up, typically your weekly mileage is going up as well. And so just to kick things off, I thought it could be interesting to maybe share our own backgrounds as athletes, and I think over the years it's changed quite a bit as to how many days per week we run, and you can still have great performances and be in peak shape running at different frequencies. So I think some people are under the assumption that if you somehow work your way up to 6-7 days per week, that is going to yield the best results. And even as a coach and as an athlete myself, I have found that not to always be the case. It's not always that once you build up to a certain level, you're going to reach your potential. Sometimes there are people that are thriving off of less mileage, and we're going to go into that factor as to why during this podcast. So kicking things off, Jason, maybe sharing a little bit about your background in terms of how long you've been running. Have you ever gotten up to the 6-7 days per week running? Where do you feel like your sweet spot was when you were in peak shape, and what do you do now?
Yeah, so I started running, in middle school and high school, track and field, cross country. So that was always shorter distance running. But once I got into my 20s, that's really when I started running longer runs, right? Like 10 plus miles. So in 2011, that was my first marathon. So we're coming up on 14 years ago. And I think my first half was probably just a year before that. So I have done, I think, a total of about 11 marathons. And I think where I started, I was probably running anywhere from like 30 to 40 miles a week for those first couple marathons. And I found that I got into a sweet spot, probably right around that 40 to 55 mile range. That was kind of when I felt my best. There were years where I did dabble with a little higher mileage. I got up to maybe the 60s, and I peaked one time at like 70. But I never followed like a strict, rule where I like had to run this many days a week. So some months, if I looked at my training, I maybe took 2 or 3 rest days. Other months, I might have had 5 or 6 rest days. So I think when I was training at my heaviest, I was always between 5 to 7 days a week. It just really depended on that week. But again, it was sort of loose, right? I never had, this streak where I had to run 7 days a week or whatnot.
Right. And just for background, that was when you were in shape to run 246 or a sub.
Or 113.5. Yep.
Right. And so for most people, that's, I feel like most people at that level, they're running 6-7 days a week consistently year round, and your mileage maybe is considered quote unquote lower. Whereas that just kind of goes to show that not everyone needs to be running the 6-7 days a week, because you were saying there were oftentimes weeks where you were doing 5 days a week of running and thriving off of that. And I think there's a lot of factors that probably played into the mileage that you were running, with just your background. Were you someone who got injured in college, or just someone that didn't thrive as much on the higher mileage, or what sort of factors led you to not be that person that was religiously doing the 670s a week? Because I know that once you kind of hit that sub-elite level, there's a lot of pressure to, oh, I got to be running every day.
Right. Yeah, I think in college I consider myself sort of a lower mileage runner for a couple of reasons. One, I always saw myself as more of like a miler instead of a 5K or a 10K runner. And so I just thought I didn't need to be training at a higher volume like some of my competitors. But then I think over time, I put in a pretty good season between my junior and senior year. And by that point, I had 3 good years of staying healthy. So the only real injury I had was as a freshman, and it was IT band problems. And that was probably a result of getting to camp, being a little bit undertrained, and then just running way too many miles over the course of 3 days. So besides that, I stayed healthy all throughout college. Had a really good junior or senior, pre-senior year summer training where I think I was averaging 45 to 55 miles a week. And then I had a pretty good season that senior year in cross country. And then right after that, I got into the working adulthood life where I was just focused on my career, and I didn't have a team or a track anymore to train at, and so my training was a little bit more inconsistent. I was still coaching at the time, so I think that helped with having that time carved out every afternoon to get some mileage in. But a lot of times I was doing what the team was doing. I wasn't necessarily doing my own workouts. So I think I started probably, doing anywhere from like 40. I on a low week I try to still hit 30. I just felt like I need to be in the 30s at least, but yeah, I think 40 was like an average number. There was a lot of years where I remember finishing the year around 2,000 miles or a little bit more than that. So a down year would have been like 1,500, 1,700, somewhere in there.
Yeah, and that brings up a really good point, because you mentioned that this is when you were working professional and kind of getting into those years. And for people who are listening and maybe don't know, that you have a decade of experience being a physical education teacher, and so a lot of that is time on your feet. And
Right.
it's not exactly like my prior career was being an accountant, and so I got to work from home a lot, and it was more of like a chill, like, desk job. And so I often had a lot of excess energy because I was sitting a lot during the day, whereas I feel like you came home from work often and it was like really draining, because you had to be on your feet for like 8+ hours a day. And so I think it's really important to note that your career might play a huge role in how much you're able to dedicate to your training. And I think it's really good that you were able to coach, because it almost like forced you to go out on those runs with the team
Sure.
after school. But it can be really challenging. I know that I work with a few teachers. I know you do as well. And Coach Athena is a middle school teacher. She works as a coach for Run for PRs, and it's definitely not an easy profession to be able to pursue your running goals. But what I found with a lot of my teachers, at least that I'm coaching, is they do kind of thrive more off of that 4 or 5 days a week schedule. And oftentimes we're doing more rest days during the week because they're able to have a little bit more time on the weekend, and they want to get out and kind of enjoy some fresh air, get their runs in on the weekend. And then it's a little bit more hectic during the week, so we're maybe throwing in rest days on like Tuesday and Thursday, or Tuesday, Friday, so that they are able to have a little bit more energy during the school day. They're not feeling like they have to get up early and run, or they have to run out the door as soon as dismissal occurs and teacher hours are up to get their run in. But yeah, do you have any tips for people who are navigating like a profession that's one of those that you actually have to be somewhere? It's like really heavily intensified, because I mean it's totally different if you have a desk job, in my opinion, because I've been in that boat. But for someone that has more of like you got to be in a building for X amount of hours, you're not allowed to leave, and you have to be on your feet all day, what sort of advice would you give on this topic of weekly mileage? Because as a 246 marathoner, you were running 30 miles a week some of those weeks. And I think a lot of people need to hear that, because oftentimes we open social media, we see people who are running 246 marathon, they're running 100-mile weeks. They're running doubles. They're running 2 times a day. So they're running 14 times a week, 10 times a week. How do you avoid the comparison trap, and how are you able to still get quality, get in shape off of the 30, 40 miles a week.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about training history being the first point here, and I think because of my experiences racing so many different races in college and high school, that gave me such a strong foundation where I could kind of get away with not training to the same level that we see some of these people on social media, right? Who didn't grow up running in college, who maybe need to run 70, 80 miles a week to get to that level. But, I think, yeah, you bring up a really good point about the energy, because that's really what motivates us, right? To get out the door every day is that energy. And that kind of does ebb and flow from time to time and through seasons of life, especially if you have a demanding job where you're constantly either on your feet or you're having to engage with people, especially children who maybe can stress you out a little bit. And so there were a lot of days where I felt like, man, I don't know if I have the energy to run like after this. And then there were other days where I'm like, I need to just run straight from the building. Otherwise, if I drive home, I'm going to look for every reason not to do it by the time I get home. So I would just leave from basically my classroom. I'd maybe drop stuff in the car and then go for a run. So as far as figuring out your schedule that fits you best, I would say, first of all, analyze what are your musts in terms of the time you need to be somewhere, right? Whether it's picking up kids, dropping off kids, getting to work, leaving work. And then from there, you can start to weigh the pros and cons of, okay, should I run in the morning? Should I run right after work? Should I run late at night? What's going to fit my schedule the best? And so I've experimented with pretty much all of those options over the years. There were years where I ran in the morning before school. There were a lot of years I ran after school. I think that was my preference, was to run right after the work day ended, before dinner and family, responsibilities. And I just felt like that suited me best, because like the longer I put it off in a day, it would probably not happen, right? You get tired. So, weighing those pros and cons, figuring out what's going to work for you. And you can probably speak to the morning running better than I can, because you did it longer than I did. There were mornings you were up, 4 a.m. and you were running. And so it's and we follow people, we coach people that get up even before that.
Yeah,
3:30.
Yeah,
long runs.
She gets up in the 3 o'clock hour.
And I think there's reasons people do it, and a lot of it is maybe that reason of like, if it's the first thing you do when you get up, then it's done. You don't have to think about it anymore. And so, yes, it's very difficult at first if you're not used to it, but over time, it becomes a little bit easier, and it will require some changes, right? Like in terms of lifestyle changes, getting to sleep earlier, that sort of thing. So.
And I think that does bring up a really good point. And lately I've been listening to some podcasts of people talking about this topic, and I think it's really important, is not every person is a morning person. And so I just like people to do an exploratory of like your own life inventory. Maybe talk to your parents and ask them a few questions too. Like, were you the type of kid, when you were a kid, were you waking up early? When you were really young, were you someone that liked to wake up early? When you're an adolescent, I think all adolescents sleep in, and like when you're in college, it's a little bit different. But I even can remember as a kid, I was kind of one of the first people awake. If I went to a sleepover, I was one of the first people to wake up. And then when I went to college, a lot of people didn't ever want to sign up for that 8 a.m. class. And I was thinking, well, that's actually perfect, because I usually wake up around 7 something. That was my natural circadian rhythm, to wake up at 7. And I don't know what time I was going to bed, probably like 10, 11 o'clock, which is way later than I stay up now. But I think being able to shift from that when I was 20 to now in my 30s, it's like, well, I wake up at 4, but that's because we're going to bed at 8. For some people, that's unfathomable. Like, take, for example, my middle brother. He's a night owl. He's always been a night owl. He was always one of the last people to wake up. Even now, I know he regularly stays up late. And so if you're someone that thrives at night, like if that's your hour, I think that I even coach some athletes. I see their runs and I'm like, wow, like you're getting out the door at 9? Like and their parents, and that's just what works for them. And even Matt Bullmeister, one of your really good running friends, I oftentimes see his workouts at 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And I'm like, I was tucked into bed at that hour, but they think the same thing of us, because they're like, why is she running at 4:30 in the morning? That's night. And so for some people that is the middle of the night, but for me, I'm like, that's my morning. And so I think it's really important to figure out, if you are that night owl, maybe you are someone that's going to thrive off of those later evening runs. And if you're that morning person, maybe you are going to thrive on that morning run, but I think you shouldn't like force that a lot. If you're someone that's like, dude, I normally wake up at 8, I don't know if 4 a.m. running is right for you, right? If you're someone that wakes up maybe at 7 and you kind of relate, you're like, yeah, I'm kind of a morning person, you could probably get into it. But I think really trying to go off of what type of personality you are will actually help in the long run, because if you are constantly forcing like a different lifestyle, it's going to be really challenging. And I can even speak to that when you were a college coach and you had like later hours. We tried to stay up a little bit later. I was taking night classes at the time, so I'd get home at like 10 o'clock at night, and I tried to shift my bedtime, shift my running later, and it just wouldn't. It was so challenging for me. And ultimately, I had to kind of revert back to what I'm doing now. So really going off of what works well for you is super important. Going into one of the first talking points here, when we're trying to come up with how many days per week you should be running, we're going to have to look at your training history and your fitness. So a lot of times people would ask me on social media, back when I first started my Instagram account, like, how many days per week are you running? How many days per week are you running? And I was really hesitant to share that because I had worked up to being someone that could run 6-7 days a week, and that really felt good to me. And so I even hesitate sharing that on this podcast now because I don't want someone to think that's like the end goal, right? And even doing that for a decade, I'm now at a place where I'm more into triathlon training, and now I only run 3-4 days a week, typically, maybe 5. And I think your training history really plays a role in how many days per week you're going to run. One of the first questions I get with some of my new coaching athletes is, how many days per week are you going to have me run? And my answer is usually probably exactly what you've currently been doing. Maybe we'll add one extra day.
Right.
Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll just extend what you're doing on those days. So the way that you can change your training structure and increase stress, one of them is to increase the intensity, one is to increase the frequency, and one is to increase like the duration that you're out there. And so we can't change it all at once, and we really have to assess those 3 variables, and I have to figure out which is going to give us the most bang for our buck. Most people, it really depends, but most people I find are already running the amount of days per week that their schedule allows for.
Right.
And so the best 2 factors that I like to play with are the duration of how long you're out there for and the intensities of what you are doing. And that's going to play a really big role in the results you're going to see. If you are willing and able to in the future, once we kind of hit, hey, you're running 4 days a week, we're going for over an hour every time, do you want to maybe add in that 5th day? I've had those conversations with athletes where we started maybe at 3 days a week, and then it was like, okay, we're at 4. And then we had the conversations like, is it worth going to that 5th and 6th day? And I've worked with people for 7+ years, and we've slowly upped the ante. And sometimes when people first work with me and they're only running 3 days a week, they're like, that's all I'm going to do. I'm not doing any more. And as they kind of get more invested, more into the sport, maybe things change and they want to run 4 days a week and then 5, or their kids get older and their jobs maybe not as demanding, or they go to part-time work. And so we have to remember that individuals ebb and flow with what season of life they are in. I think, pre-kid me, I could go out and run doubles every single day of the week because I had a lot of energy. I had a desk job. I had a flexible schedule. There's a lot of factors that went into why is she running twice a day most days. But now it's like I run once a day, maybe if that, 3 to 4 days a week. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. It's like I have 3 kids that are 7 and under. I also don't have the same desire to train at the high level that I had trained at for a number of years. And so you really have to look at a lot of different factors that go into it. The next, that kind of dives into what are your running goals, right? So we really have to label and define what those are in order to figure out, how many days per week should I be running? So for me, after I ran sub 3 back in 2022, I just kind of didn't have that same desire to train at a super high level. And so that allowed me to assess how many days per week I wanted to be running. And instead of running the 6-7 days a week, I kind of cut that down to 4 or 5 days per week, just because my running goals weren't as high. And so I didn't really need as high of mileage. Whereas in the past, it was the opposite, where I was like, hey, I've been running 4 or 5 days a week. I want to work up to doing a little bit more because I want to reach my full potential in the sport. So maybe it took me a whole year to go from 4 days a week to 5 days a week. It took me maybe another year to go from 5 days to 6 days. And as you increase, you really have to assess, is this helping or harming? And there's a lot of analysis that has to be done during that time to ensure that you are doing the correct amount of volume for you. So, Jason, how do you help your athletes with their running goals and figuring out how that plays into how many days per week they should be running?
Yeah, it's sort of doing a deep dive on these three topics. It's the training history, the kind of the current or recent fitness that they've been doing, and then tying that to the goals that they have, right? And so figuring out, what we obviously want to start with what they're doing. We don't want to just because it's marathon training, we're going to jump up to 5 days a week if you've only been running 2 or 3. So it's connecting the dots slowly and having a map almost, figuring out what do we want to do when, and then how do we progress safely to keep the person healthy, keep them excited about training, keep them motivated, because you don't want to be doing way too much. And so, yeah, it's a very individualized approach, but I think we try to gather as much info as we can on our intake form, and then I always have some questions right away with an athlete about, questions like their most recent tough workout, stuff like that. I kind of want to know what they've been doing. So I just ask questions, and then I can observe through training the first few weeks of working with somebody, sort of the level that they're at. And I think that over the years, like you mentioned, ebb and flow, and running goals, they may change based on season of life, or whether or not, depending on how they were in the past, reaching a goal or being short of the goal. They may just maybe that's part of the discussion, is identifying a different type of goal that's not really a time-based goal.
Yeah, running goals, they do play a factor in how many days per week you should be running, but I feel like it's more on the side of, let's say you're someone that can run 6-7 days a week based on your history, and maybe you realize you don't really want to focus on running related goals, and you want to maybe take a little bit of a step back or just focus on a triathlon. That's where it comes into play more. It's no, we don't need to be running 6 days a week if you're training for an Ironman. Let's drop it down to 2 or 3, especially with your running background. If you're someone that's only running 3 days a week and your goal is to qualify for Boston, and you say, hey, my running goals are really big, so I'm going to run 6 days a week, that's not really an appropriate way to assess how many days per week you should be running. It's you have to be safe about it, and so your training history comes first. And if you don't have the history to back how many days per week, we're not going to be able to skip steps along the process. So even if you have really big running goals, we still have to do a really gradual approach to how we get up to, let's say you really want to work up to that 6-7 days per week. We still have to be really gradual and careful about how we do that. And the next point that comes into this is your injury history plays a huge role in how many miles per week you should be running, and also your recovery from runs, right? So if I have any client that ever has had a history of bone-related injury, stress fractures, all of those things, stress reactions, number one, I want to make sure that it's really important that they have had DEXA scans and they're getting blood work done to make sure that everything is on track, where they're not going to have some sort of deficiency, because in my experience, just in the running world, it seems that people who get stress fractures, it typically is a reoccurring issue unless they address the root cause of that. And so that's really important to take a look at that. Then I'm going to be really careful and cautious with how we come back, just knowing that, hey, this person is maybe a little bit more susceptible to bone-related injuries than the average runner, right? Because if you've had one, that in and of itself is a huge flag to me as a coach. Okay, we're not going to be running 7 days a week. We're not going to be doing 6 days a week. We're going to probably be doing an every other day approach. And the reason that I like to do every other day approach for people who've had an injury, especially bone-related injury, is it allows more recovery in between. And when you're adding on additional stress onto additional stress, it compounds over time, and that is what leads inevitably to those bone-related issues. If you're someone that has that underlying, maybe you have a mineral deficiency or some sort of nutritional thing you're working through, it's really important to start with a low volume and increase very, very slowly. And even when someone doesn't have a bone-related injury, let's say it's soft tissue, whatever it may be, right? You've had calf things flare up, maybe it's plantar fasciitis, whatever it may be. I'm still going to be really cautious. If someone's had an injury in the last 6 to 12 months, it's it's telling me in the past what maybe you were doing was a little bit too much. And so sometimes I will ask, like, how many days per week, how many miles per week were you running when you got that injury? And then I'll take note, moving forward, let's not try to do that. Let's try to really ease our way. And it's a lot of checking in. It's a lot of getting that feedback from the individual. And sometimes for these athletes that are more quote unquote injury prone, a lot of it is holding them back. And that's really what a good coach does. They know when to push someone and they know when to hold them back. And so sometimes people, they sign up with a run coach because they think we're just going to push them. But really, for some athletes, myself included in this camp, they need to be held back. I'm the type of athlete that needs to be told, hey, you're overdoing it, because I have the tendency to overtrain. I think people who have a injury history probably have the tendency to overdo it, overtrain in some capacity, and they're unaware of it. And so as a coach, my job is to figure out, okay, I need to bring that to awareness. What are you doing that's causing these injuries, right? Like, what are the patterns that I'm seeing happening? And then trying to call them out as I see them and really be aware, because each individual is so different, right? You might have one athlete that is super prone to overtrain, and then another one that's more prone to undertraining. And that's why I think there is that art to coaching that you can't really get with an app, or you can't really get using like an AI generated thing like Garmin or that Runna app, because they don't know your tendencies and they don't know your background as intricately as another human would know, like your personality and all of those things.
Right. Yeah. Injury, it's a complicated one, because the definition of an injury can vary so much. It could be a stress fracture where you literally can't run for weeks. It could be a strain where, yes, you can't run, but you need to be working on strengthening it, because if you just rest, it's never really going to go away. So I've done that before. I've had calf strains over the years, and I just let them be, and I take weeks off and I try to run, and it flares right back up. So you need to strengthen certain injuries. Rest won't work for certain, like, muscular skeletal injuries, like tendon issues, stuff like that. So plantar fascia is another one of those that I bet it probably just won't go away with rest. It might over time. It depends on the severity of it. But the other thought about injuries is just, like, if it's something that feels better or loosens up after you're running a bit on it, that's a better sign than something that gets progressively worse when you're running on it. So you got to assess that, right? Like, in terms of like adjusting training, that's really key, I think, is as soon as something's flaring up, assessing the severity of it, and then you need to have like a good either team that you trust, whether it's like a PT, a doctor, or whatever, a chiro, someone you can go to, right? Your coach, your spouse that you can talk to about the issues, and get some some advice from someone outside of your own head, because sometimes we can make the wrong choices about things. So like you were saying, like you would have a tendency to overtrain, and so it's important that we have other people involved with these sorts of things, and then we can make the best decision to overcome them quicker, right? Without losing fitness.
And another thing, how you were mentioning team, and then you talked about a medical person, I think it's really important to note that it's really great to have a PT or a doctor on your side that can help you guide through that process, prescribe exercises that are going to help trigger the result that you want at the end, right? But the worst thing that I've had happen to me, because I've had things flare up, even non-running related things before, like when I was pregnant, I had like a back issue that occurred 8 years ago. I've had plantar fasciitis before, and the first doctor I went to for both of those injuries was just like laughed at me. It was like, oh, whatever, just stop being active. Basically, stop doing everything. Just you're screwed. And it was kind of that whole approach of like take Tylenol and rest for like indefinitely. And I think it's really important to go to medical professionals that have experience treating athletes. Treating runners specifically would be really ideal, but there are some really great PTs out there that know exactly what to prescribe for runners, exactly how to work with athletes. And I think there are some people who are in the PT field that are more experienced working with people who are coming out of a surgery or who are really lacking in mobility. I mean, you have to think of the general population, right? Some of these PTs, their specialist is literally to help people who are in assisted living, maybe who are 80, 90 years old. And so that advice maybe works really well for someone who's in their 80s or 90s, but For a 25-year-old marathon runner who wants to get back out there and has 60 to 80 plus years ahead of them, I think that that's not the greatest of advice. And so it's really important to get that second opinion if you feel like, hey, this advice wasn't really working for me. And what I always did wrong in my early 20s is like go to the first person, whatever they told me, I was like, oh, this is gold advice. You're a medical professional. You're wearing a white coat. And I would just do whatever they said. And typically it was, rest, don't run. Or when I was a kid, they said, oh, you have asthma. They told me I had asthma. And I'm a sub 3 hour marathoner now. So I don't understand. Like, they were like, don't run. They told my mom, don't let her run. Don't let her exercise. Then another time I thought I had, this is when I was in high school. This is from gym class.
Sports-induced?
Yes, sports-induced asthma. I got diagnosed. Yeah. They didn't give me an inhaler. They just told me don't run. At 15, don't run. And then when I was 16 or 17, I got like shin splints because they made us run in gym class, and this is how out of shape I was. I literally got shin splints from like running 2 laps on the track in gym class a couple times a week. And I went to the doctor, got imaging done. They were like, no, this is shin splints. You're not built for running. Not built for running. And what's funny about that is now in hindsight, it's like, what? I've done 27 marathons. I'm a sub 3 hour marathoner. But this is what they were telling me in 2007 or whatever year it was. Hey, yeah, you're not built for running. Just give it up. And so I was like, oh, yeah. And I go, that makes total sense, actually, because I'm not, right? Like, I'm the worst person in my gym class. And these other girls, they're like toothpick thin and they're running laps around me. And so going back to the whole point of this, I share that story to say I've been in offices where people tell me, you got to stop running. You're not made for it. You're not meant for it. But you really have to seek out people that kind of know what they're talking about and that can encourage you on the path that you think that you should be going on, right? And everyone has different specialties in their professions. And, maybe that doctor that said, you're not built for running, maybe he was used to working with people that didn't really like gym class and didn't want to run and wanted to hear that messaging, and maybe that's like the right thing to say to some people. And I'm not trying to talk poorly about anyone, but sometimes you just need to seek a second opinion. So next, diving into lifestyle factors. So that's going to be work, family, other commitments can all impact how much time you have for running. It's really important to find a balance that fits your lifestyle. So after I became a mom, 8 years ago now, I think a lot of people were anticipating like a huge shift in my training and not being able to train at all, because that's a really big marker for a lot of people as to how much they're able to train. And when you're watching someone on social media, it can be really interesting to see how they navigate different life challenges and changes. And I actually did cut down probably like a 50% reduction in how much mileage I was training. And it was still probably quite a bit of running I was doing, but it did kind of make an impact of how much I was able to run. And even, you add in a second kid, add in a third kid, it does impact maybe how much time you're willing and able to dedicate to your own training. But that doesn't mean that you can't make the most out of the time that you do have. And so one of the big things I always say is focusing more on quality instead of quantity. So I had to take a good look at what I was doing before, which was running, I said I was running doubles almost every day. So probably I was running 10 times a week. But if you really looked at what I was doing pre-kids, it was just a lot of easy miles and a lot of sometimes runs that were unnecessary, right? So what I did is I tried to figure out what were the most key important parts, what are the hard workouts that were really important, and try to still incorporate that touch into my training. And maybe just have 2 key days per week, maybe even 1 key day per week that's like, this is my hard workout, and all the other days I don't really care what I do. If I can get out for 2-3 miles, that's great. If I can't, whatever. If I feel great that day and I go for 6 miles, that's awesome too. So it's more about being flexible. I think when you have a seasonal change like that, especially when you become a parent, it can be really stressful if you're trying to hold to the same standard as what you were doing before. You're just going to get frustrated. And I see that a lot with new parents. Like sometimes people won't even try to get back into running because they're like, there's just no way I will be able to. It's so overwhelming to think of training the same amount of time. But I find that when people have more gradual approach, like, hey, it doesn't have to be this black or white all or nothing thing. It can be, let's just go outside for 20 minutes 2 days a week. Let's start with that. And it doesn't even have to be a run. Like I have a free program on our website. It's a 6-week walk run program to get you from literally doing nothing, doing zero, to walk or running a 5K in 6 weeks. And so the first run I think is 8 minutes walk, 1 minute run, and then 4 minutes walk, 1 minute run, 3 minutes walk. It's just basically you run a total of 6 minutes or something in there, and with a ton of rest in between. And over the course of 6 weeks, we decrease how much you're walking, we increase how much you're running, and it's just a really sustainable way to get to where you want to be. Whereas I think sometimes people are like, oh, I got to get back to getting out there every single day. And it's like, no, as long as you can commit to just showing up a few days a week, that's the best way that you can just build momentum. And it's almost better to do less than what you think you should in your head, because once you're able to build the momentum, that's the thing that keeps you going. And if you're setting your expectations so high and you're consistently failing to reach them, that's not really going to be a good motivating force to get out the door. If, oh my gosh, last week I didn't get in any of my workouts, I think it's better to start small and see what you can do from there. Lifestyle factors are real though, so be aware of that when you're following people on Instagram, like especially these influencers. Some of them, that's their full-time job, right? Like they don't have work, they don't have kids. And so if you're looking at their weekly mileage and comparing that to yourself, and you're like a teacher with 3 kids, and it's just not going to be a realistic comparison.
Right. Yeah, to me, a lot of this is connected, like the individual needs. Sometimes our preferences don't match the factors that we have to deal with, right? But I think, you know, you said a lot of good things about, kind of lowering expectations, and there's going to be seasons where maybe you don't have such a time pressure related goal, right? Like you could still train for a race, or instead of doing a marathon, maybe do something shorter. There's other ways to approach periods where you just feel like you can't give it your all, or can't train the way you want to train, but then you have to still weigh the pros and cons. Like, is it still worth doing the event? And a lot of times it still is, right? Especially if you can be okay with training less. And so there's been a lot of times over the years where I've had to recover from injuries and then weigh the pros and cons. Like, is it still worth moving forward and doing this race, or should I just completely give up? And I've coached a lot of athletes where, I've seen them, they get to their goal race, it's over, and then because they don't have another race on the calendar, or because, they have a trip coming up and then they don't plan on doing any races for a few months, they just quit altogether coaching, and then they pretty much quit running too. And then it can be really hard to get back. And so I think, we're getting a little off topic here, but the thing that we want to really do is run the amount that you feel you can be consistent with. And sometimes during a marathon training cycle, it's okay if it's a little bit less than what you would like to do, just in order to make it work for you, right, in the situation you're in.
Definitely. Yeah, it's really important, that consistency piece. I think it's really hard when people completely fall off the bandwagon taking a lot of time off, because then you also have to think, so anytime someone's coming back from time off, like even if during pregnancy, right, like I ran way less than I ever normally do, and then during postpartum you have to take time off, and then as you build back, it's like I had to run less coming back every time, because it takes time to build back up to running the 6-7 days per week. So you have to be really patient in that process. And I think it can be a really frustrating time for people that have like a history, right? So if you are someone who took any time off for whatever reason, maybe, you went on vacation, you just lost motivation, whatever it is, you have that rose-colored glasses you're looking at of, oh yeah, remember that one time when I was in the best shape of my life and I was running 6-7 days a week and it was amazing and I was so fit and it was so effortless, and then you're lacing up your shoes to go on your first run after 3 months off, and it's the hardest run of your life. You're only going 30 minutes, and the whole time you're beating yourself up in your head because you're thinking, this is just a 30-minute run. I never even used to run this short, and why does this feel so hard? And you're never going to get back there. And then you go and you do it again and again, and it's just really, it can be really difficult. And so my biggest thing for anyone that's on a comeback journey is stop comparing to the past. Stop looking at what you ever used to do. You're not that same person. And unfortunately, it is going to take time to get back to where you were at. I've actually even heard before, as a rule of thumb, you can imagine in your head however much time you took off is going to take you that much time to kind of get it back, which is unfortunate, but also hey, I mean, that's how it goes, right? So if you took 2 years off, it might take you 2 years to get back. It might not. It could take you less, but keep that in the back of your head is, you are kind of a beginner in some ways if you did take extended time off. And so give yourself that grace of being a beginner again and understand that's going to play a factor in how many days per week you can run. I think there was a time back in the day where I could run 10 to 14 times per week, and that would be not a big deal. If I did that now, I would be destroyed. And so you really have to respect where you're at and figure out, hey, would that even be something that's ideal for me right now? First of all. Second of all, really, what are my goals? And is there a better, smarter way that I can actually reach them? Because while I was, in fact, running 10 to 14 times per week at one point back in, 2016, I would gather to say I'm probably in similar shape to what I was then, and I'm running 4 days per week now. So, I mean, really, you have to think about training smarter, not harder. And I'm not trying to say that I hated it every second in 2016. I loved it. And that's the reason why I was running that much, is I absolutely loved it. And now it's like, yeah, I still love running, but I don't love it that much that I'm going to go out and do it that much. And so that's another thing you really have to keep in mind. Some of these people that are on these run streaks, or they run all the time, like they love it. That's why they're doing it. And so if you don't love it as much, or you don't love it enough where you want to go out there twice a day, that doesn't make you any less of a runner. That doesn't mean that you're going to have worse performances. It just means, hey, we're all on different paths. And that brings up a really good point. I also had an issue where I was on a run streak at one point. So what is a run streak? That is where you don't take any rest days. And I've seen this on social media. There's someone out there. There's people out there all the time that have 1,000-day run streaks, whatever it may be. I think at first, it's good at first, right? To have the idea of being consistent and all of those good things, but there becomes a line in the sand at some point, I'm not sure when, where it becomes almost like a destructive behavior. And I think I've shared on this podcast before, the old CFO at the company I worked for, when he found out I had a run streak, he looked me dead in the eyes and was like, I think that's OCD. And I laughed because I thought it was a joke, and I was like, he doesn't get it. But his wife was a marathoner, so he did get it. But he was calling me out, no, that's actually you actually have a problem. And honestly, I did. And now in hindsight, I can say, hey, it is kind of a mild form there. It was I had this obsession that I had to go out. I had a compulsion every day. If I don't go on this run streak, I'm going to lose fitness, or something bad will happen. And that's kind of crazy to admit that on a podcast, but hey, that's the reality. And a lot of the people that are on run streaks, I'm friends with some of them, and they have the same, they have the same compulsive, oh my gosh, I have a fever today, or I feel really sick today, but I have to go out on my run streak. I really don't want to do it, but I feel like I have to because I can't break my streak. And it's why? And we really have to start asking ourselves those questions. And are these behaviors helping or harming us? So maybe in the beginning, your run streak was to help you be consistent for a month or two, whatever. But somewhere along the line, it became a harmful behavior. And that's what it happened to me. And this is, 10 years ago now. But you really have to recognize when it is doing more harm than good and cut it off, because you don't want to be doing things that are detrimental to your health, right? So I do think running can become something that is unhealthy if people allow it to be. And I think there are some people that have more of those addictive personalities, myself definitely one of them. I don't even drink at all anymore because it's just I have a hard time moderating it. And I think rest days are really crucial for allowing your body to repair and rebuild. So don't underestimate the power of having that weekly rest day. Some people are really good. You're really good. You can moderate everything. You don't need to have coffee every day, and you can just have one drink, and it's no big deal for you. You're someone that doesn't really have a very extreme personality of oh, nothing. So I think you're the type of person where you can schedule in those rest days when you feel like you need them. There's some people that are really good about that. My mom's really good about that. And then there's other people where they will not take a rest day, because I'll wake up and be I have a hard time knowing and trusting myself. So instead, what I do every Sunday is a rest day. I have to schedule it. Otherwise, I will not take it, or I'll really struggle, and it'll become this whole mental thing. So I think for some athletes that are really type A, having one scheduled, super crucial, because otherwise, if you're left to decide that on your own, I feel you're probably going to have that tendency to keep pushing, and that's not good. So having something scheduled, super key. And remember that just because someone else on the internet has a run streak doesn't mean you need to do it. And remember how some activities that start off maybe with good intentions can become harmful. And I think with a run streak, you really have to have like an end date in mind, right? Because otherwise, like, when is the end? And I have a friend that had either a 6.5 or 7.5 year run streak, and during the last 3.5 years, it was every day, like, texting me, I don't want to do this. And so, 3 years of torture is what it ended up being in the end. And initially started out as a great thing, and I think it became something that was terrible.
Yeah, as you're talking about the run streak, I was just thinking about like why people do them, and
it's addictive.
It's like they want to be perfect at something, and at first it sounds like a fun challenge that they can have complete control over. Like, I can get out the door and run every day, and then it becomes something they have to do because they have to maintain that perfectionism, right? Like, they have to keep doing it. And
perfectionism.
It gets to that point where, she was at year whatever, 4 or 5, and
7.
It would have been way harder to stop than it was to just go out and keep it going every day.
Yes.
And so it's a good reminder to not be so rigid and have a perfectionist mindset in terms of like training for a marathon. It's better to be flexible with yourself. You don't have to follow these exact rules. You don't have to hit 60 miles a week. You don't need to do 3 20-mile long runs. You don't need to do 14 miles at marathon pace. Like, all these little like rules that we kind of set for ourselves, I think the intention is maybe there, and there's a reason for it. Like, it's to teach us to be more confident, right? But we can gain confidence through less rigidity and more flexibility. I think there are other ways we can kind of test ourselves and to be more, optimistic and motivated. So
yeah, and I think the really hard part about that, with like the whole run streak and the whole being so rigid about things, is if you even look at professional sports, right? I think baseball, I mean, you know more about sports than I do, but there's a lot of like rituals that people will do before they like go to bat, or like the pitchers, and they have like these like ticks that they do, and these rituals that people have, I do think can maybe help them mentally in some way. Like, it's something that's a clutch, it's something that's maybe helping them in some regard. But you really have to keep it in perspective. Like, are you a professional athlete? Like, are you an NFL player? Are you in what's the professional baseball field?
MLB.
Are you in that? And if you're not, I think we need to take a step back and realize like why we're running in the first place, and come to maybe a little bit more of like a healthier place, because ultimately a lot of people are running for health more than they are running for performance related benefits. And so we really want to have it a place where we can enjoy our training and be able to train for a long period of time, and it be a healthy endeavor instead of reinforcing some of those behaviors. Because sometimes if they can get out of control in running, right? Like, let's say with the perfectionism, with the, I have to run streak every single day. Sometimes those really controlling behaviors can trickle into other areas. So maybe it's, I can't eat this food, or I can't, and so that can kind of lead down some of those other disordered paths that we don't want to fall down. And so that's why I think it's just important to be aware of the behaviors, and then also to just advocate for a little bit more balance and to call things out when we see them. And that's another reason why it's really great to work with a coach, because it's like sometimes we have these blind spots, or sometimes we're going through these things and no one knows that we're on a run streak, or we feel embarrassed to talk to someone about it. But it's like, we've seen this so many times play out, and we've coached people that have these streaks, and sometimes just getting on the level of the person and being able to like relate and help them kind of see and work through these things can definitely help with not only the mental side of things, but also performance, right? Because even looking back when I had my run streak, I was regressing in my running, and by running less, I was actually able to improve and get better. And when I did run my sub 3 hour marathon eventually, it was probably about 30 minutes faster than what I was doing when I was running 14 times a week or 10 times a week, and I was only running 6 or 7 days a week when I was doing that. So running half as much and running 30 minutes faster. So that's all we have for today's episode of the Run for PR's podcast. I hope this has given you a better understanding of how to determine optimal running frequency for your individual needs. Remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's finding what works best for you and allows you to achieve your running goals while staying healthy and injury-free. If you're looking for personalized guidance in creating a balanced training plan that takes into account your unique needs and goals, head over to www.runforprs.com to learn more about our coaching services. Until next time.